it's Matt Martin here from Photobook Cafe, and thank you for joining us for our new series, Behind the Photobook. Within this series, we talk to a range of different people, all from photographers to graphic designers, contributors to publishers. We really want to delve into some of our, and hopefully some of your, favourite photobooks. This episode, we are talking to photographer Michael Collins. We had a book launch of his new book, the NUCLEAR SUBLIME, which is published with RRB. It was really exciting to hear about Michael's work. We had a great chat. Michael's a hugely established photographer. He was also been a picture editor. He's designed sort of 6 books put together. He's had books published with Mac and Stidle and Dewey Lewis. And so it was a really nice chat, and hopefully you get something out of it. So please join us for my conversation with Michael Collins. So yeah, Michael, I really wanted to just sort of have this discussion about your new book, The NUCLEAR SUBLIME, which has just been released with RRB. We had a book launch for it last night. How did you feel that went?
Oh, it was great. Nice mixture of people. And when you do something like this, you have no idea how it's going to be received.
No,
and also
exactly.
the diversity of responses. So something like that was wonderful, really.
Have you done a lot of for books that you've had previously? Is that kind of a big part of it as well, is having that sort of launch and sort of being directly connected to the sort of audience?
No, this was the first book launch I've ever done, actually.
Okay.
I'm lousy at marketing.
Right.
And when you do a book, you sort of wait for press and all that, but there's like a sort of big dark silence, and you think, oh, has it disappeared? And then you find out that it's gone here and there and that sort of thing. But so this was the first situation that I've ever done. Yeah. And I really enjoyed it. Yeah. No, it was a really lovely evening. I think we also had a talk and everything that went alongside it. And it was great to sort of hear that sort of backstory, especially between around the imagery, and actually also I really enjoyed the sort of conversation of sort of the getting into these places and sort of the protocol that you had to sort of go through, and I thought it was really interesting. So I've been having a look through sort of your archive and stuff like that, and to actually say I didn't properly know your work beforehand, and it was interesting to sort of have this as sort of a start off thing to sort of delve into. But then looking back through your work is really interesting to see that sort of idea of covering British industry, and obviously you've done books in the past sort of on that topic, and I really wanted to sort of. You've done power stations in the past. I think you've documented Battersea and a few others. What was the sort of jumping off point for this kind of project? Were you approached by someone for it, or was it a personal thing? Well, I work in a documentary style, as Walker Evans said, although there's not a documentary intention. And for me, the power industry is very interesting on a number of levels. Partly, I find industrial structures fascinating. And in power, you've got everything from sort of pylons to cooling towers to power stations, etc. So as a sort of field, it yields tremendous possibilities. Also, there's a lot of decline there. A lot of industrial archaeology is just razed to the ground before it can actually be properly recorded, let alone preserved. And so the first power station I ever went to was Battersea Power Station. Right. And
I mean, what was it like going? Because I guess for Battersea is kind of one of those. In my mind, it's probably one of the if not the most famous power station. Well, to me, especially coming into London on the train, you sort of came past it every day. I mean, what was that? Were you going into that space? It was all derelict and everything within the core of it.
So I went in there nearly 20 years ago, when it was owned by another company that then bought it up to then do this great big, somewhat cheesy renovation. And the thing about Battersea is it's so iconographic that it's hard to get past its fame when you're photographing.
True, yeah.
Or so I thought. But actually, when I went there, I was amazed that it's so much taller and bigger than you think. When you actually sort of stand at the base of it.
Right.
Particularly then, when there was nothing around it except rubble. It's vast. Of course, in industry, there's just the scale of things. Doors are thicker and bigger. Everything is mighty. So I got access there, and they originally said that I could have just 3 days. It's so big, and I was using an 8x10. Having to light some things. There was, there were no lifts and stuff, so you were hauling stuff up and down these concrete staircases all the while. And it would take a very, very long time. You'd have, in those sorts of interiors, you'd have lengthy exposures, all sorts of things. And it was winter. I photographed between sort of January, February, really. So it was very, very hard work and very slow. And they'd let me have one more day and then one more. And eventually I was there for about a couple of weeks, I think, in total. And they actually put me through this training course that I could go around unattended, which was a big relief. But there was hardly anyone there at the time. It was almost mothballed, right. Which was nice for me. I didn't want to have signs of demolition or renovation. I wanted just as it was. The ideal situation for me would be to photograph these places as it were on a weekend when there's no one there. I don't want people getting in the way, because then they become the center of attention. And also, if you're doing it like inside one of the turbine halls, it was really low light and really cold, and stopped down. The exposure was very long. It was about 20 minutes, and because it was so damp, the film would pop in the film holder because the ambient moisture and air was so radically different from that inside.
Right.
So I had to then tape film to the inside of the film holder, which is very difficult to do, and then return to then do the same picture again. And I got about 3/4 of the way through this one exposure, and suddenly a dumper truck with a flashing orange light drove through the picture. So you want no one around.
Yeah.
But it fascinated me, and I try to take pictures that aren't flattering or indeed accusatory or whatever, but just as sort of as simple and faithful as possible. And so that really sort of set me off in some ways, I think. And it was probably I very rarely photograph things that have any level of fame, but that was a sort of famous thing. So it was exhibited at the Reba Gallery, and that was a very nice thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going back through the archive. I really loved, looking at those pictures, and it was nice to see that sort of, because they're like 2006,
something like that. Yes.
And so with this, was there a connection to the FT for?
Essentially, I got onto Battersea because a friend of a friend was involved with the corporation that owned it. Without that, they won't let you on. You have to be escorted. It costs them money. You're a pain in the arse. There's insurance. It's a drag. And I got into places like St. Pancras when they were renovating that and rebuilding it and stuff. But access is a dark art, and it would take dozens and dozens and dozens of emails to get into places, and you nearly always had to have some sort of authority who would commission you. So I used to the former curator of photographs at the British Library, which has an amazing collection of photography, particularly 19th century photography. They have the old India Office collection, so imagine what that's like. And he's now retired, John Falconer, the former curator there, is a brilliant photo historian. He would write letters on my behalf.
Right.
So, for example, once I got them to close the Dartford Crossing Bridge so I could photograph views from it, which would have been impossible without a letter from some authority like that.
That's incredible.
And then eventually I wanted to do cooling towers. But if you write to EDF and say, I want to photograph your cooling towers, you won't even get a response.
Yeah.
But if the Financial Times magazine commissions you to do this, so the FT magazine had published my work on the Hoo Peninsula, for example. So sometimes, I like writing about photography, so sometimes I would approach a publication and say, look, how about you publish these pictures and I write something to go with it, and it made a sort of good feature for a magazine.
Yeah.
And I'm quite interested in putting pictures in a different context. I make them all principally for exhibition. As large prints, sort of 4 foot by 5 foot prints. They're photographed on 8 by 10 negatives, which are drum scanned. You end up with 600 megabyte files. The level of detail is such that you can actually put your finger on the print itself and see very, very clear, crisp detail. It doesn't blow up in your face.
Yeah.
And I want to do that. I want to be able to look at the whole picture and also look at the minutiae within it.
Okay.
That, for me, is part of engaging with the picture. But putting it in different contexts, a book or a magazine, is interesting too. Anyway, the FT did this thing on Who and a few other things. And I then approached Emma Bowkett and said, look, I wanted to photograph cooling towers. Can you commission me? I'll do a feature, and you needn't pay much, don't worry about your budgets and stuff. And I'll write about it and make a feature. And so, they agreed. She kindly wrote these emails. I gave her a list of PRs, got into the sites, and it was, the editor actually said, cooling towers, really? But they got a big post bag about it. People love cooling towers.
They do, yeah. I think it's very much a staple of, British sort of landscape. It's all sort of.
They're the sort of pandas of the industrial landscape, really, aren't they? Cooling towers.
Yeah. When you see one, you're like, ooh.
Yeah. Who doesn't like a cooling tower? And then a few years later, there came an opportunity. In fact, I then had this discussion with a previous colleague of hers called Liz Joby, who's now left the magazine, about going into Dungeness to photograph the nuclear power station there, Dungeness A. And the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority wouldn't let us proceed. They tried to censor the choice of journalists to accompany me, and quite rightly, Liz Joby said, this is journalism, not public relations. We can't go along with something like that.
Right.
But then about a year or so later, Emma got in contact and said, look, we've got this journalist going to Sizewell, to Sellafield rather. Do you want to accompany him? It's only going to be a day visit. And I said, brilliant, yeah. And then I contacted the writer, this guy, Jonathan Ford, and said, look, Jonathan, I don't believe that Sellafield will give us very good access because they're notoriously paranoid about press and things. But if you can get onto their PR and we can go to a couple of other sites at the same time, we'd have a much better sort of chance of getting good photography and a range of photography, which would make a bigger, better magazine feature. And so Jonathan got on the case with this, and we ended up going to Sellafield and then 2 other sites in the northwest, Trosfinid, which is in Wales, in the mountains, and Wilfer, which is on Anglesey. It was a lengthy process. They took 9 months getting a security clearance, which admittedly happened in the middle of lockdown, nonetheless. And when we got there, it was, you go through all this rigmarole of, what you can and cannot do, and everything's X-rayed, and, once we got inside, it was astonishing because, it's always exhilarating going somewhere where you're not supposed to be normally.
True, yeah.
And so, they literally pulled back the curtain and showed us lots of things, some of which were sort of fascinating to look at and realize where you were, but were photographically sort of impossible. Also, unfortunately, it was a brilliantly sunny day, and I never take photographs in sunshine because I don't want the shadows, I don't want the harsh light, I don't want saturated colours. So all the outside pictures, I kept my camera in my bag, which amazed the handlers. And one of the situations was extraordinary. This great big pond, a notorious place where they stored highly radioactive stuff after the Windscale fire in the 50s, and they were cleaning it out, but the light was just awful, and they thought, well, hang on, this isn't journalism. And I said, well, yeah, I'm not really a journalist. I'm doing this for a journalistic context, but I'm not like a sports photographer.
No. Yeah.
Anyway, but they were.
And I guess like with that, because looking back at previous work, I'm noticing that now that it's very much the palette is of that sort of very even, in one word, grey Britain, in the sense of there isn't that sunshine and that sort of that contrast. And I think that's like, but so really this was kind of a perfect sort of situation within. You didn't do any of the outside. You were just sort of encapsulated within.
That's right. No, I mean, I want cool colours. I want no shadows, and I don't want sort of garish photography. Plus, usually the people who give you a hard time on these sites are the PRs who say things like, "Oh, you can't photograph that because it's rusty," or there's stuff coming out the chimney and people are going to think that we're polluting. You are polluting. But in this case, it wasn't that you didn't deal with PRs on site. You dealt with the head of security. And so on every site, at the end of the day, the head of security would go through my camera and look at the entire take on the memory card.
Wow.
Looking for anything that showed security infrastructure.
Right.
So any exterior, any fence, camera, sensor, gate, tower was not allowed to be photographed. And they're just surrounded by these. I mean, a nuclear power plant is like a high security prison. It's full of big buildings and high wire fences with cameras.
I think there's one that I've seen. I used to photograph a bit along the River Blackwater. Yes. You have that one opposite. It's very much in a
Bradwell.
Bradwell. It's just a block, basically.
Yeah.
And you can walk right up to it because people go to they go and walk along the edge of the palace to go to the beach.
Yeah.
People sit on that sort of thing, and so but they are this mysterious sort of. Even though you see the sign, you kind of know it is a power station. They have their own sort of. You feel a sense of eeriness and like being next to a prison, don't you? It's very
definitely
much a very enclosed. Don't come in. You can't see anything inside. There's no windows. There's hardly ever any people around.
That's right.
And it's there's such interesting monuments, I guess, in a sort of.
They're spooky places. I once photographed this electricity power station up in the northwest, sort of Ellesmere Port Way, and called Rock Savage. And I recce'd it first, and I realised that if I went to the car park outside the fence, I could just stand on a step ladder with a tall tripod and take a good picture. And so I get there early in the morning, thinking there's no one around. And get my stuff out quickly and put the camera on the tripod and get the stepladder and sort of set it all up. And I've got my head under the dark cloth, composing it on the ground glass, when this voice in my ear says, "Hello," and I thought, "Who's that?" And the guy says, "Hello, I'm here." And I took my head out under the dark cloth, and he said, "Look up to your left," and there was a camera. The guy said, "Wave."
He was talking through the speaker on the thing.
Yeah. And they're that sort of place.
Yeah. You are. It looks like no one's there, but you're always being watched.
You're always being watched.
Yeah.
And they are sinister because I mean, when you go to coal or oil or gas-fired power stations, they're mighty things, and they're serious stuff. The turbines are huge. This is where they create power. And so they exude a sense of power in them. The buildings are massive, and they've got thick walls, and there's tons of concrete, and all that sort of stuff. And the workers are serious engineers. It's hard work.
Yeah.
It's quite tough, But you go to a nuclear power station, and the thing is, radiation is invisible. It's not like a pile of coal or a furnace or something. It's eerie like that. You know it's there, doesn't smell, and you can't see it.
Yeah.
Which, again, is quite a sort of charge when you're photographing. Anyway, so I went to these 3 places, and I'm using a digital camera now, but I use it in the same way as the view camera. So I have a cable release and a spirit level, all those sorts of things. And the people accompanying us, the sort of press team, as it were, from the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, thought, oh God, this guy's slow, and why is he using a tripod? And hurry up, mate. And they thought I'd just sort of have a handheld camera like a sort of press photographer.
Yeah.
And I explained why. And then, so the first day they were sort of a lot of humming and hawing. But eventually I sort of won them over a bit, because they could see whether I was a crank or not, I was being very diligent. And then when the pictures came out, they really liked them. And through, I was introduced to the managing director, the chief executive of the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. And he said, how come when we commission photography, the public back off from it and don't really trust it? They're suspicious of it. And yet your photographs look trustworthy and sort of accessible. I said, well, 2 reasons. A, I'm doing it on my own terms for me. And secondly, I use this old aesthetic called the record picture aesthetic. He said, what's that? I said, well, when photography was invented, before it had actually come into use, industry used to commission technical draftsmen to draw pictures of canals or railways or whatever it is under construction, to record what was going on. A, for their engineers to sort of inspect, and B, so that their investors back in London could look at these albums of the canal and think, yes, that looks a sound investment, everything's going according to plan. When photography came out, it was not only quicker and cheaper, but even more accurate. So they trained surveyors to take pictures. And industry was one of the first people to really take up landscape photography. And they became known as record pictures. I said, and that's what I do. And I showed him this book I did with Michael Mack about 20 years ago when I went through the archive of the Institution of Civil Engineers.
That was like a Steidel Mac combo.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Exactly that. And
is that still available? Is that still out?
You can find it. You'll find it on eBay or AbeBooks, or it's out of print, but it's around. Anyway, he was intrigued and said, look, we need the public to engage more with us, because the level of ignorance about nuclear energy is so great that there is no informed debate beyond the sort of a tiny proportion of the population knows what's going on. And in fact, the government policy is going to be to bring nuclear power center stage, because they can't keep using fossil fuels, and nuclear power is in that respect clean energy. So he commissioned me to go to a few sites and said, I'd like to make this into a book. And I said, well, I can't do that, I'm afraid. I was happy to give them portfolios of prints. That's fine. But to do a book, I said, it would then become like a nuclear industry book, and I can't do that to the work. And he said, well, what do you have in mind? And I said, well, what I'd like you to do is to pre-purchase 500 copies of the book, and that'll give me the budget to then have it printed.
Wow.
And I said, I can only tell you 2 things about the book, because it has to be at completely arm's length, so that you have no control or whatever over it. And he said, okay. I said, you can have it at the beginning of 2024, and the book is called The Nuclear Sublime. And he agreed. And so that's how I ended up with a sort of carte blanche to do the book I wanted. I then went to see Rudy at RRB Books, showed him some prints, and said, look, what I want to do is give you a certain number of books for you to market and stuff, with your logo on the spine and your ISBN, and you promote this and embrace it as an RRB book, even though I'll be delivering you a finished product.
Yeah.
Which is sort of unusual thing to present to a publisher.
Yeah, definitely.
And again, good man, Rudy knew my work, and I said, fine, bring me the book when it's ready, which was great. So I then went to see Richard Krujak, who is a designer who'd done landscape and industry book, my railway book, the Who book, and the Family Silver book. And I said to Richard, look, this time I need the book to be different from my other books. My other books have been very traditional, the plate on the right-hand page, left-hand page blank, an essay at the front, list of plates at the back, a fairly conservative cover. And for this, I said, the fact is, my frustrations with previous books is that however good they are as a sort of reference, they can never really impart a sense of what the actual prints look like, because at full size, the prints look so different from the plates. The detail and all that sort of stuff comes through. So I said, what I want to do is to have these sections here, like this sort of thing, which is essentially what that bit of the print would look like on a full-scale print. And I said, I also, because I want to present this as the Nuclear Sublime, I want it to look alien to anything people have seen before in terms of the cover. So that's why I chose the cover, which, unless you were told what that's like, or unless you were a nuclear expert, you'd have no idea what it is.
No, yes.
and to have this hot red on it, too, which was, again, a very... Richard and I spent a long time working over those things. And he loved it. He said, great. He said, look, and brilliantly, he said, let's have red end papers too. Perfect. And then he also said, what about a yellow ribbon? Brilliant. So you've got, because as you can see in the interiors, they're full of emphatic colours. And I wanted that within the book. So, and also for the book to be slightly jarring almost, not noisy, but demanding.
Are you a collector of photo books? Is it something that
sadly,
you enjoy?
I am. Yeah. I mean, it gets out of hand.
Yeah.
And I mean, the weird thing about photo books is you can have a book that's full of good pictures, or does have good pictures in it, and it's not very well designed. And you can have books that are interestingly designed, but a photography that I don't like.
Okay, yeah.
And it's very hard for the two to sort of intersect, I think.
And I mean, a lot of your early profession was being a photo editor as well.
Back in the day,
in the day. So going into a project like this is something... What is your process, especially when doing something on your own work compared to being a photo editor of others? Do you feel a very easy connection there, that sort of working with other people's work, especially in a sort of a newspaper layout or something? Do you find a lot of ease in putting a book together? Do you find that you can sort of bring images to flow and to have that story?
Well, I mean, it's been 30 years, almost 30 years since I was a picture editor.
Right.
And I look back now and I think it seems like a slightly made up world. But one of the things that, and of course, when you're working on a magazine, particularly it was the Telegraph magazine, which is right-wing middlebrow. And, he had this editor who was a sort of bon viveur, and an art director who loved things like Harper's and Queen and Vogue and stuff, sort of Condé Nast culture. And then me, and we were just, the odd lot,
Right.
It just, we did not see eye to eye on anything really. And so I would commission a photographer, edit down the pictures, and then work out a sequence. And then the art director would come along and sort of go, oh, you know, and then the editor would come along and go, no, what about that picture of the cute girl in the pink dress? Why don't we open with that? You know, and you think, are you stupid? But
so a different ball game, really. Sort of.
It was, yeah. But one thing I mean, I only worked in editorial photography for 8 years, and I very, very quickly got into this position. I think because most people, and I know this sounds terrible, but most people don't look very closely at photography. They kind of, it's almost, I don't know, I'm amazed. You know, if you deal with things like literature and stuff, poetry, whatever, unless you read it closely, it doesn't mean anything, unless it's sort of Pam Ayres or something like that. But with photography, there's a sort of almost a leisurely engagement. And yet, if you take it very seriously and really read the pictures, then a lot more comes through, you know, content, form, all those sorts of things. And so I very quickly became immersed in editing work and in sequencing work. So, for example, as I said to you the other night, I sequenced the Richard Billingham book, Raise a Laugh. I edited it down from carrier bags.
It's being reissued, actually, isn't it?
Michael Mack's reissue. You know, originally I was given all these carrier bags of triple prints by Richard and whittled them down. But in editing, you know, there's very much, you know, it's not like a sort of greatest hits. There has to be a visual flow of pictures.
Yeah, exactly.
And not fancifully, it has to be sort of some meaning behind it, but nonetheless, it can be a lyrical progression. And so I found that was just something that I became attuned to. And so in this, on the one hand, there's a logic, which is essentially you're moving chronologically from older sites, which would be fission nuclear energy, to eventually fusion research sites at the end. Sites from the early 60s, mid 60s, 70s, 80s, through to current ones. At the same time, I don't want to have abrupt changes in pictures, except now and again where you maybe want a new chapter or a sudden break. So you'll see that there is a formal link from one picture to another as you move forwards.
And is the double page spreads, is that break? Or
sometimes I want a double page spread, to sort of get past this thing of just plate on the right hand side. I also wanted things where you do not allow the reader to lull into a sense of predicting how the book's going to be.
No, of course.
So something like this will sort of immediately break that.
Yeah.
And also, you know, like in the previous, in something like this, for example, you know, it forms a naturally good comparison. These are the containers with which they would put spent fuel casings and stuff in these ponds, so the radiation is contained to some extent. This is a new one, and this is a used one, which forms a sort of pleasing before and after sort of pair. And at the same time, makes a nice jolt, really, I think, from the previous picture, which is, you know, I think a very beautiful close-up of the crack in the pond, believe it or not, to the thing that was in it. And then, because I want to sort of flow, and then so something like that, which, I mean, they're quite a busy pair of pictures in some ways. Something sort of quieter. So you're having a sort of that kind of movement in the work.
Yeah. I think that's
again. That's another natural pair.
Yeah.
As I was taking the picture, the guy said, I said, "What is that?" He said, "Oh, it's uranium." I thought, seriously? So anyway, I took a picture and then went to look at the back of the camera to see whether it was, you know, it looked good on screen.
Yeah.
And check all the technical things. And when I turned around, he said, "How about this?" And he'd taken the lid off it. I know.
And ran and dived for cover.
Well, If he opened it,
Yeah,
he's not going to.
I'm sure it's yeah. I mean, yeah, it's interesting. I think for me, I think it's when I sort of put books together as well. I like to have that thing where I push the viewer out and then I pull the viewer in,
Exactly.
and you have that thing. And I think that's what you have here, especially with the sort of, and when you have that sort of break of a double page spread.
Yes.
It does do that, and especially with work like this, where in a sense it's kind of, to me, it's kind of like a Where's Wally in a sense. You're very much like, every time you look at that picture, you can see something new, or you're drawn into certain parts of it. It's such a thing that you can look into, and then you have these beautiful sort of detailed shots that then sort of pull you in, and then you're leaning out, and that's what the double page spreads do, and it's such a perfect way to sort of structure something, and I think for the viewer especially to be sort of carried that way.
Structure is a key word. I mean, things, whether you see it or not, things have a structure. And so the first thing I would plan in this is the structure. Because if you have a structure, it then means things can work sequentially, and they're in a meaningful context.
And so what was this? So have you ever done any sort of self-publishing?
Well, I mean, in some ways, this was vaguely.
I mean, kind of, yeah. You came with a RRB, with just sort of.
Yeah. I mean, every book I've done has been initiated by me. I've never had a publisher come along and say, "We want to do this.
Give us the work. We'll put it all together." And,
I've always sort of found the financing for it, and this and that. So it's just what I know, really. Apart from the first book with Michael Mack from the archives of the Institution of Civil Engineers.
So for that, I mean,
but even that, I mean, I'd spent 2 months inside their archive, and then went to see Michael and said, "Look, so all of those things. I mean, I'm sure every photographer says this. There's an awful lot of work up front and during the process."
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's what I want to sort of also touch upon with these discussions. Really, is not so much to sort of inform the viewer on the actual sort of ins and outs of constructing a book, but what the actual front and end parts are in terms of how do you approach a publisher? Do you self-publish? How do you decide all these factors? And then the aftermath, doing the book launch, getting it into bookshops, all that sort of stuff is all compiled around the main factor of actually putting something together.
It's absolutely necessary. Distribution is incredibly important. Some people are very good at, they have thousands of Instagram followers and they go to all the book fairs and stuff. I'm terrible at that. So, my books end up in cardboard boxes.
But what was the run of this? Was it 8?
So this was a 1,500 run.
1,500?
So the engineers the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority had 500 copies, and which is not many, but is enough,
And so how do you go through the process of things like, obviously you worked with a designer as well on this, and you had a great sort of collaboration. Are you looking at other photo books in terms of thinking like what the size is going to be? Are you taking any influence from anything else? What's the reason for it being a hardback compared to a softback? What sort of paper you want to choose? How do you sort of bring those sort of decisions into place?
I wanted a hardback, definitely, because this size paper, it would be difficult to do paperback. Plus, you've not got that big a print run, so it's fine to have it bound as a hardback. The paper size, the bigger the book, the more expensive it is. And one of the key things you're looking at throughout is the unit cost. If you print 1,500, what does that cost per book? At this size, it means you get 4 pages, 4 double pages per sheet of paper, one on each side. And paper is very expensive. It's not brilliant paper, but it's good paper. The better the paper, the more expensive it is. So that is a big determinant on the size of the book. The smaller the book, obviously, the cheaper it is to print. there is also this thing that big books can be nice to look at on a table, but they're a pain. They stick out in your bookcase. Some books are just too big. They're unwieldy. They become very expensive. And as Rudy pointed out to me, they sell a lot of their stuff through the post. A big book costs a lot more in postage fees.
Yeah, and those are all the factors that you have to think about. I think I did a book on some America work I ended up doing like a tabloid sort of newspaper kind of thing. And you sort of, yes, it's great to have that whole thing where you can open the book and, you feel like you're in the pictures, but actually going down to the point where I then had to sort envelopes and boxes, and no bookshops wanted to take them because they're too floppy and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
You really have to consider those factors, especially when trying to give the book a life after it's been,
particularly where you have a print run. If you're doing 5 artist books,
sure, yeah,
you can do it whatever size or shape you like. But if you're going to have it going through retailers and all these sorts of things, you have to look at practicalities as well. And a publisher will say, fine, you want to do that, we can't possibly handle it. No, those are key things, really. And of course, if you go to various printers, they will advise you on paper stocks and those sorts of things.
So this was done with
Goma,
which are based in Wales?
Yeah, they're in mid Wales.
Mid Wales, yeah.
And
they've come and given us some books here, actually. And I think quite a lot of photographers, because obviously we do different book launches and stuff here. We've had quite a few photographers also sort of go through Goma, and they seem to be sort of one of the sort of leading sort of printers, slightly, especially for a UK-based printers, when there's a lot of people are printing out in Turkey or Poland or.
Well, the problem is if you print abroad now, because of Brexit, it becomes much more difficult
Getting the books back into the country.
And the thing about Goma is that they have everything under one roof. They do the binding as well, which is an advantage. They got brand new Heidelberg equipment. So in theory,
is this digital offset?
Yes. Yeah. So in theory, they can do everything really well. Of course, it's like having a camera. Just because you've got a great camera doesn't mean you take very good pictures.
Yeah.
And much of their output would be fiction with illustrations, or just straight fiction, or catalogues for museums. Photo books, they don't have that big a record in it. And when I printed this, for example, you'd normally sort of sit in, they have a big boardroom which is like a library with all their books in the shelves. But they needed that for a big meeting. So the managing director said, look, you can come and sit in the side of my office if you like. Because what happens in, they output a sheet, and when you're pleased with the output finally, you then wait for 20 minutes until they output the next sheet. And so you're always you're killing time.
Yeah. Sometimes they put beds and stuff in it because you can be there for days, or you're signing it off in the middle of the night, or
because they work around the clock.
Yeah.
They don't want the machines idle. But anyway, I go back and forth, and I'd be speaking to the managing director, and he said to me, how's it going? And I said, can I be frank? And he said, please. And I said, well, not very well. The initial outputs are too magenta, and they shouldn't be. And anyway, so he said, well, so they were printing more. You keep printing the sheet until it's ready, and the cover just kept coming out too magenta. And of course, if you start taking magenta out, what you do is you dull the red. And I didn't want the font to be dull. It had to be sort of a hot red. And he said, well, this is very difficult for us to get the printing you want. Maybe this is just too technically demanding for us. I said, no, it's not. You have the equipment. It's just, and you have the printers. It's a cultural thing. If one's printing in Westphalia or Verona or whatever, you're expected to print really well. There's a very, very high standard to live up to, which hasn't historically been the same in Britain. But, you could be printing the cream of British photography books here. You have all the facilities. You know, it's easy in terms of distribution and transport. It's not far to, you know, it's okay, it's a long drive to get there, but you can just stay locally for a day, oversee the printing, and then drive home.
Yeah.
You know, that's not a big deal. Go on the train.
Yeah.
And so we go back and forth, and eventually I got the book I wanted. And I think, you know, he thought, and he's a very nice guy, and I think eventually he thought, actually, either do this or don't do this, you know. And so I think Goma are now more serious about doing seriously good photography books.
Rather than being sort of, I guess, like a sort of print on demand kind of style of
thing.
yeah, no,
Yeah.
for sure. I mean, that's really interesting to hear, because I think that's like a lot of people don't talk about that sort of you know, the process to getting it right, and what can go wrong and what can go well, and how
the
both
dust,
can learn, basically.
the dust jacket was reprinted 3 times.
Right.
You know, to his credit, Jonathan, the chief executive, said, okay, no, we'll do this until it's absolutely right for you. And the 3rd time, I'm very pleased with it. You know?
Yeah,
I think the printing's extremely good.
Yeah.
And they're a nice bunch. They're friendly. You know, it's nice to photograph somewhere where you're not having to fly to go and see it.
Yeah.
It means that the ecologically, there's, you know, the carbon footprints are much lower if you're printing, you know, in the same land, etc. You know.
Definitely, and so, like, obviously, you know, there's sort of amazing printers before, but obviously, yeah, bringing stuff back in, sometimes language barriers and everything like that, especially when you're trying to get something, you know, so specific. It's great to be able to have that, you know, on your doorstep, per se.
And you know, the cost of doing this book was something like 60-70% of the budget of a competitor abroad, which matters a lot. You can pay, you know, you can pay an awful lot for something.
Yeah. And so I'm interested, just to sort of, I guess, end on sort of maybe a couple of questions. I kind of want to hear a little bit, I guess, about what are the photo books that draw your attention when you're either in the bookshop or, let's say a bookshop. You go into something. What is dragging your eye to it? Is there a particular cover? Never judge a book by its cover. Are you particularly looking for just certain types of photographers, a certain type of book? Or are you quite open to just sort of browsing the shelves and sort of finding out what's happening?
That's a difficult question to answer, really. Generally, and of course, there's got to be exceptions. I like photography that's quiet, and in this sort of matter-of-fact genre. So, you know, I love the work of the Beschers, for example. And I think those Chemin Moselle books are wonderful. They're very straightforwardly produced books, very straightforward photography. The white and black and white photography is, you know, it's a very, very good series they produced. Sometimes, as I say, a photography book can be very well designed as a thing, but it might not be the kind of photography I like. Like, for example, you know, one can look at those William Klein books of New York and Rome, etc. You know, and they're very well designed. I just don't like that photography. I find it raucous, really, and a bit superficial. So I much prefer quieter photography. So generally, quieter photography is going to be more in a more quietly designed book, which is not terribly exciting in terms of comparative book design. I buy less and less photography books than I used to, and I'm always looking out for new work, but of course, like anything else, there are certain vogues which attract attention and which get distribution, and other things just don't fit in with that. Michael Mack's books, for example, all have a sort of certain sort of shape and design to them. There's a certain style of, most of which I don't really care for. They're very well done. You know, he's a great publisher. They're well distributed, but I just don't particularly like the photography, and I don't want a house style book.
No, that's interesting.
But I don't know. It's a difficult question to answer. I mean,
it's like saying what sort of music are you into?
Exactly.
You know, exactly. Yeah.
And also, you know, 10 years ago, you know, Tate Modern had a fantastic big bookshop. You know, there were those bookshops on Charing Cross. You know, they've gone. Where do you go to a bookshop where you can browse through tons of books? Very, very few.
And
And
Photobook Cafe.
but you know, but there were bookshops which would be 3 or 4 times the size of this, with all of the books around. You know, even the Photographer's Gallery bookshop doesn't have as many books as you'd think it would have.
Right. Yeah. I mean, to counter that, I think London especially is obviously we have lost a lot, especially sort of in Soho and stuff like that. But I think the Tate are actually doing really well with the photography books at the minute.
I disagree.
Really?
I mean, yeah, I think they're you know, that bookshop downstairs is now turned into a sort of toy shop.
Yeah, I don't go to that one. Go to the one in the other.
Go to the one up.
section.
They used to have far more than they have now.
Okay. Yeah.
And they say, you know, because of course lots of books will just sit on the shelves.
Yeah.
And I mean, culturally I don't know what you do about that, but there should be subsidised or something, so that you can go into a bookshop and there be thousands of books that you can browse through, and that there just isn't. You know, I think the Tate is particularly bad. You know, their approach to accessibility would make McDonald's blush. You know, it's really, plus, you know, they bought the Martin Parr photo library.
Yeah, and we never see that.
And that's hidden in a cellar. You know.
No, I think I was listening to exactly that. I was listening to like a David Campley chat or something, and he was saying, yeah, so people have these prints, they go for sale, the museum buys them, and then no one ever gets to see them. And I think, especially with books, and that's, you know, the reason for us as well, is that we really believe that shouldn't happen, and books should be available to the public to see on a daily basis, and you should have access to books that you can't see everywhere else. And they shouldn't be they obviously should be respected, but they shouldn't be not be able to be read, which is what they're designed to.
That's
for,
right. I mean,
you know,
the problem is, you know, we live in a neoliberal society, and Britain is as neoliberal as it gets. We follow the American example. You know, in America, you know, all these institutions, they live off grants and donations, which they get big tax breaks for. You don't get the same thing in Britain, and there's not the same level of wealth. So you can't possibly run these cultural institutions on private donorship. But they, you know, I mean, we need more taxation, definitely, and we need a better redistribution of wealth, so that it's not some. I mean, art is, let's face it, a middle class hobby for many people. They do it on a Sunday, which is crazy. But these institutions, you know, the Serpentine, the Photographer's Gallery, Tate Modern, etc., Tate Britain, all these places, the Hayward, should have funding to have much, much bigger bookshops, you know. And I mean, they do their best, you know, but imagine if the Whitechapel had a bookshop 3 times the size with 3 times the level of stock.
Yeah.
Think how much more accessible that is to other people. But you don't get that at the moment.
No.
You know? And I doubt the same is possible in France or Germany either. It's sadly, you know, the contemporary economics aren't doing us any favours.
And then, so just to kind of end it, I'd like to sort of see what would be your advice to, obviously we have a lot of people that are just getting into photo books or self-publishing. What would be your sort of key part of advice into getting into producing your own photo book?
There is this cliche in photography that you do some work, you're really pleased with it, and then you look for the book and the show, as though that's sort of the FA Cup and the league. I think that's a sort of crazy, oversimplistic route. First of all, some photography doesn't really work very well in books, and some photography works very well as a book and not very well as an exhibition.
True. Yeah.
So the two things are not necessarily hand in glove. Also, don't underestimate the amount of time and resources it takes. I've probably put, beyond just taking the photographs, 1,000 hours or more into this book. Writing the essay took a long time, lots of research. You're going back and forth. It's not something you can rush. I would think very carefully about not the book being a sort of greatest hits type thing, but being something in its own right. That's why this book is designed the way it is. That's why it's sequenced the way it is. That's why it's an odd thing. It's sort of weird. A yellow ribbon, sort of hot red type. What's going on? What is in some ways that's sort of slightly ugly, and that's sort of slightly beautiful, and yet that is where they used to load uranium rods at Dungeness. And this is, in theory, the future of clean fusion energy. A book is a physical thing. You shouldn't flick from the back, but it is a physical thing. How do you make that work for you? What do you actually do to make it not just something that's like a reference book? How do you put blood in its veins? And I think before people sort of rush into I want to do this, I want to do that, they need to ask themselves, a bit like when you take a photograph, surely one must ask, why am I doing this? What right have I got to do this? And what does it actually mean to me that I'm doing this? And I always think that about taking photographs, and I think the same about a book. And that would be my advice, to ask oneself those questions first. And I think just by doing that, you put yourself in a space where you're open to finding receptive people. And you need receptive people. You need people to help you. You need people to take it on. You need people to sort of talk about it, to help distribute it. And you need to get feedback from people too. Essentially, even if you make a book as a completely independent venture, it's then got to go out into the outside world. And it doesn't mean you produce something like you would make a sort of mass-produced product, but you need to be aware that it's got to go from your hands to the outside world. And as you said earlier, that means it needs to be able to sit on a shelf and go in the post.
That's a perfect ending, I think, for that. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Interesting. Michael's book, The Nuclear Sublime, is available to purchase from RRB Books. And thank you very much. I can't wait to see the next one.
Thank you.